Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another video Fish by podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Shirley Paulson, and today we're going to be talking about what can we know about the historical Jesus. So welcome back to this show, Dr. Paulson.
Oh, thanks so much. It's great to be with you, Jacob.
Thank you. Glad to have you here. So can you tell us a bit about what do you think we can know about the historical Jesus and how we can know those things?
Gosh, really, that's a huge question to throw at me, but it's such an important one. I want to try my best to go there with you. It's funny. I've thought about how hard it is for us to get to know what happened last week. I mean, we have social media, we have judges, and we have eyewitnesses, and we don't even know how to say what happened last week, let alone 2,000 years ago. So just realizing how hard it is to get at the truth of things, we need to keep that in mind when we think about antiquity. But it's important, so we need to try. So I think the I was not a part of the Jesus seminar of West Star from 20 whatever years ago, but I think they left for us some important ways of thinking about that question. And for example, they have I think 4 criteria that I think are useful to think about in terms of how do you judge what was going on in antiquity. And one is that all history must be reconstructed from incomplete evidence, which we need to take into consideration, and that historical knowledge comes from varying degrees of certainty. We can't really know some things in the same way we know other things. And then also, there really is a critical distinction between historical and religious truth that we need to recognize, again, the difference between a faith thought and a historical event, because those things can get blurry too. And then finally, that historical claims need to be demonstrated. You can't just sort of say something happened because you think it did. So those things are kind of helpful, I think, in terms of judging what's going on in the past. There are all kinds of artifacts and little scraps of papers and, tractates and things like that we can read. But putting the pieces of the puzzle together is not just a simple matter. So I might just share with you one example I have of how it is that we need to recognize what we're reading into these things. I came from, my own experience has been one of healing, where I've been involved in my religious experience that makes me expect healing, and I experience healings. So when I know that when I read ancient texts, that's what I look for, and I find them. But I have colleagues who read the very same text and don't see anything at all about healing in there. So the question is, did it happen or didn't it happen? As far as I'm concerned, it did. As far as they're concerned, it didn't. So those are part of the questions that we have to take into consideration when we figure out what's going on in the past.
And when you've examined these texts and you came to your opinion, your conclusions on the matter,
Yeah.
how do you yourself determine what is historical about Jesus and what is not historical about Jesus?
That's really good to ask that question. I think most of us care about Jesus just because the way we've learned Jesus has an impact on our lives. So some people would just say, well, the facts don't matter at all. We just want the inspiration, the ideas, whatever. We don't even care about history. But I think history matters because we want to know that we're leaning on something that's valid and not just our imagination. So I think that's an important question. And we have to learn how to sort out the difference between facts from fiction. For example, we might be interested in watching a Spider-Man movie today, which I don't think any of us would be concerned that it was a historical event that we watched in the movie, but there are, maybe we could say, historical truths that come out in a fantasy movie like this. And it's the same thing with learning the facts of Jesus. I think that maybe there are wonderful stories, and maybe we even know that they are stories, but we can sort out from there things that are useful facts. And that's what takes us into the way the scholars, I think, have helped us, especially in the history of historical criticism, to know which ways are useful in terms of sorting out facts from imagination. For example, we have source criticism, which would help us sort out where did it really come from? Was it a valid source, or was it a competing source with something else? Why is one source perhaps competing with another? That source criticism is really helpful. And then there's a form criticism, which would say, well, this piece doesn't really have the legitimacy that another piece has because it doesn't fit the form the way it should be if you're going to look at that for that kind of information. And then there's textual criticism, which means, is this text really an ancient text, or is it something that was maybe written by somebody else later? So there, and then of course there's a well-known feminist criticism, which includes even more modern renditions of it with womanist criticism and queer criticism. It just goes on and on, all the different lenses that we can bring to these pieces of information to figure out where's the validity in it.
So what do you think that the historical Jesus did that left an impact on the world?
So you're asking me, do I think of him as a historical person? I do.
No, I know you do. I was asking, what do you think that the historical Jesus did that left an impact on the world?
What did he do? Yeah, that's again a very good question, because I think it's the impact that matters. And so the way I have leaned pretty heavily on, for example, some of the findings of the Jesus Seminar from West Star. I think that they did a lot of scholarly research on what their general consensus was as to what Jesus actually said and what he actually did. And even though I don't lean on that 100%, I just think it's a helpful guide in terms of deciding what he did and didn't do. So I think the Bible, I'm pretty convinced that the synoptic gospels tell us a lot of things that Jesus said and did, but the fact that we have 4 of them shows you that they aren't all telling the same story. So they're not exactly telling you everything that happened. And there are reasons for each of the synoptic writers or authors to say what they did. And for example, when you take the Gospel of Mark, which seems to be the foundational text for Luke and Matthew, then you can see kind of how Matthew and Luke maybe added on things for certain reasons. So, and same thing with the Gospel of John, it's so different from the others. And you have to ask, why is it different? And how historical is it? So I tend to look at those stories and think, okay, there's a story here that's important for me to understand because it has an impact on me. And I don't think I believe anything other than perhaps the fact that he was born and he died, he lived, and all those things. But some of the things just seem like they're stories for a reason. For example, the trial of Jesus before his crucifixion. I think he was crucified. I think historians would agree he was crucified by Romans. But would he have had a trial? I'm not so sure about that, because first of all, he wasn't a Roman citizen, and they wouldn't have gotten people together like this so suddenly. He didn't have a right to a trial, and he was probably just a nobody as far as the Romans were concerned. Why would they wanted to give him a trial as opposed to everybody else they crucified? So there are reasons like that I kind of doubt that story of the trial was a historical event, even though there was a crucifixion. So things like that make me think I can look at the story and decide, well, there was a reason for telling about a trial in terms of understanding the relationships perhaps between the Jews and the inner parties of the Jews and their relationship to the Romans, but it probably did not take place in a trial the way it was written. But the impact. I mean, there's what's interesting about that question, I think, is that you're getting at the fact that we have the stories of Jesus because he left such an enormous impact on history, that you really need to look at why did people react the way they did to the things that we know. Even I'm curious about, for example, the stories of the birth of Jesus. I mean, since I've been a child, I've celebrated Christmas with my family. Everybody celebrates Christmas, but there are only two accounts of it, in the Matthew and Luke. And if it was such a big event, why didn't the Bible writers talk more about it? Paul never mentioned it, and Mark and John didn't even talk about it. So it makes you wonder. And in fact, Matthew and Luke don't even tell the exact same stories. They're contradictory. So how much of that can you take as fact? Again, I think he was born. And I think there was an important reason for his being born. And I think it was the reason for his being having those birth stories are to show that he was very important, and his birth left an impact on us. So those things I think are serious and important. But I have to read the stories of his birth event with a bit of a doubt in my mind as to exactly how that happened.
Do you think that there's any reliable information in Gnostic texts that may tell us certain things about the historical Jesus?
That's a great question. I spend a lot of time thinking about those texts, and I wouldn't do it if I just thought it was all fantasy. So, and yet they were written, obviously, at least 100 years after Jesus, maybe more. So we don't have eyewitnesses. But then again, we don't really have eyewitnesses of Jesus either. Jesus left an impact. So when I read the events of the New Testament or the canon, I think I grew up thinking, oh, this is the fact. But then when you read contradictory things, you think you can't have two opposite facts going on at the same time. So when I've gotten involved in the extra canonical kinds of writings, I ask the same kind of question. Why did this leave an impact on people? They cared a whole lot. The fact that there were a lot of these texts, even more than are in the New Testament, is telling that something about Jesus' life left an impact. Why would people in the 2nd century care so much about Jesus? So I think, for example, and many of these extra canonical writings are post-resurrection stories. So I don't think that, for example, we can take the Secret Revelation of John, where the frame story for that is that Jesus comes in a vision to John and tells him all these wonderful things. Well, this would have been after the resurrection. And in fact, this story was written many decades later. So John was not on the earth anymore, and neither was Jesus. So I think they're telling a story, clearly a story, to make a point. I think that what's going on with those texts where they're trying to imagine how the things that Jesus said are really helpful to them in the 2nd century, I think they're getting at the way Jesus taught and the way Jesus was conveying important ideas. And they may not have the exact words, but whatever it is that he said and taught and lived continued to impress people in such a way that they turned back to it to find inspiration. So I don't think that Jesus came to John in a vision and said all these things, but I do think that whatever Jesus did and said was very real to people. Another example I might just throw out there would be the letter of Peter to Philip, because that one is again another story about the disciples of Jesus getting together because they're terrified they're going to be killed. And that's probably a very real thing, that they were still suffering from the fear of crucifixion long after Jesus was gone. That was still going on in the Roman Empire. And yet whoever wrote that in probably the 2nd century was envisioning back at a time when the disciples might have been talking to each other about Jesus. And the story in this letter of Peter to Philip is that, again, a voice or a light comes to the disciples to guide them. And so there again, they're talking in the 2nd century about turning back several decades to what Jesus might have said that would be helpful to them in a later period. And they're using the disciples to frame the story. Well, the disciples are dead by now, so they're not telling the story. It's not a historical event, but I imagine they felt real comfort from what they remembered of Jesus in the time of real need.
So do you think that these Gnostic texts may have been using perhaps common sources, not just using the New Testament, but could there have been lost text that they use as sources, but the common sources that both the New Testament and their own text utilized?
Yeah, I can't wait to find that. I'm sure that there's going to be more that will be uncovered in the centuries to come. For example, who cut off the front pages of the Gospel of Mary? I don't know, but they must be around somewhere. And so yes, I do think that there were sources we don't know about that contributed to the writing of the 2nd century. And the Gospel of Thomas is a really curious one because scholars think it could have been even before the synoptic Gospels were written, or maybe it was long after. Who knows? But there's too much commonality between the parables in the Gospel of Thomas and the parables in the synoptic writings. So there was conversation going on. And then clearly Mary is another very intriguing character that draws these texts together, because in the synoptic Gospels, there's first of all 4 Gospels in the New Testament, Mary is involved in the resurrection or the end stories with Jesus. They seem to agree on that, but there's more about Mary in the other texts, like the dialogue of the Savior. Mary's kind of a key figure there who seems to get it. Now, again, we can't prove that's the same Mary all the time. She seems to be showing up in certain ways in a pretty regular pattern that seems like it's possible. She shows up in the Gospel of Thomas as in competition with Peter, just like she's competing with Peter in the Gospel of Mary. So clearly there's some kind of connection, I think, between these texts and the way these characters come about. So yeah, I'm very eager to find more. I'm sure there's more out there. The fact that before 1945, we didn't know any of this means that, well, what'll happen in the next 2 centuries? Something's going to be out there. There's too much evidence that these things are connected, and I'm eager to find out what it was.
And what do you think that the historical Jesus taught?
Well, it seems like you're almost kind of asking me to explain what my interpretation is, because it's very hard to get my hands on those exact words, other than, again, I rely on the Westar Jesus Seminar that sorted out what Jesus said and what he did as carefully as I would know how to do that. But I would say that I take from that and my own reading some things that are important to me, and I'm sure everybody does this. You tend to read what you want to read, and I can't help it. I mean, I think everybody does that. Unless you really want to deconstruct everything, you tend to look for what you are interested in. I've always been interested in a healing message that doesn't seem to get talked about too much, but I think that the writings in the New Testament certainly convey a healing message, but I also think that there's more of a discussion about how that happened in the extra canonical writings than actually in the New Testament. A lot of scholars who talk about the healing stories will agree that Jesus didn't tell very much about how he did it that's in the New Testament. But those other texts that are not included in the New Testament seem to me to talk more about how he did it and why. And so I can understand why they would not be in the New Testament. I mean, because this is just my own theory here, but you asked and I'm going to tell you. I think that when Nicaea happened and there was a call for a consolidation of church doctrine and even power and how to govern the church, you can find the replication of a hierarchical structure that patterned itself after the Roman hierarchical structure. Well, any kind of writing that would include healing or women, for example, would be a threat to that patriarchal hierarchical structure, because healing means that you have your own access to the divine power. And if you have your own access to the divine power, you don't really need the church to have the power over you. That's my theory about this. So the texts that seemed to me to talk about healing are also the texts that seem to exclude the women more often. There are more women leaders and more women participants, like Mary Magdalene, in the extra canonical writings. And I just think that could be because the hierarchical church didn't have space for that. That's just my view on this, on what I think. So in my answer to your question is, I think that Jesus certainly he taught about the meaning of his father's realm, if you will. Sometimes he uses the word father, sometimes not. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I think there was certainly a connection with the divine realm that was important to him. And I think he thought of it in the context of, in contrast to the Roman power and the Roman authorities. But I also think that he thought of it in terms of finding peace and help in the face of the Roman oppression. So that's why, again, healing would be a natural response to that, because the Roman oppression would be complete domination over your whole body, mind, and soul. And his message was freedom from that, I think.
In my closing question, what do you think caused the early followers of Jesus after Jesus' crucifixion to believe that he had risen from the dead?
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, this is so interesting that this question leads us to, again, the impact of Jesus as opposed to maybe the historical facts of Jesus himself, which is why this whole question is so important, because it is more about impact than even the historical facts. So the impact is of great importance. It's what led us into Christianity itself, for the way the impact it's had on the world for so long. So it's a very important question, but I think it does lead us into this question about what's the difference between fact and impact, if you will. So I think the remarkable thing is that after the after the resurrection, or after Jesus was gone, it's a curious thing that there's no immediate writing about it. And there's not even any artwork about this until long afterward. So it seems like if the people right then and there saw Jesus in whatever way they saw him, for some reason they didn't communicate it very well, because it took people later to put it in writing and talking about it and doing artwork about it. And that makes you kind of wonder, again, that it seems to have had more of an impact later than it did immediately, or at least the people at that time had whatever reason didn't write it down right away. But I think what's wonderful about this is that the stories we do have of the people who saw him have different stories. And to me, that just says that it doesn't matter so much what kind of body he had, but it matters that people could see that he did not fail. They could see that his mission kept going in a way that they could connect with. They could see it, they understood it. I love, for example, the Gospel of Peter, which is rarely talked about because it sounds kind of weird. But that's the story where after the crucifixion and Jesus is buried in the same place that the other sources talk about, there were soldiers who witnessed men coming, I think, out of heaven, two men coming out of heaven and entering into the tomb because the stone rolled away out of its own accord. And then they witnessed three men coming out of the tomb, and the two men are so tall that they reach the clouds, I think. And the third man that they're supporting, because he's so tall, reaches above the clouds, which appears to be like they're bringing Jesus out of the tomb. And he's so tall, he's above the clouds. And then Mary comes along and witnesses all this also. So again, this is sort of like part of the same story, but it's different because it goes into something that just sounds on the surface, well, that's not possible. That's not a historical fact. But it tells me this is the way people thought of it. It's like they're describing the transition between Jesus' earthly body and a heavenly kind of being. And so any artist who tries to paint a picture of something that's a thought has difficulty putting that on canvas. Same thing with writers who try to put it in words. How do you describe this transition between the human and the divine? I think that's what this author is doing, is trying to find some way of describing the meaning of this transition between Jesus, who looked like he failed on the cross, but rather who did not fail because he's embodying everything that really reaches into heaven. So that's just an example to me of the way people were struggling to find the expression of the impact that he left for them, that he was not a failure, that he's teaching us something that's enduring, powerful, and real about his relationship with the heavenly being, the heavenly reality. There's so many words I can use, but they don't all make sense together. But even, spiritual, not material, there are just different ways of talking about it. But I hesitate because there aren't any actual words that we can use very well right now. But they certainly left an impact on so many people in so many different ways.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Shirley Paulson.
Thanks. It's a lot of fun talking about it. I appreciate it too.